Welcome to the Mind Vine podcast, where we challenge the stigma associated with mental illness through conversations about a variety of issues impacting mental health. Here we bring you news, views, and interviews that intrigue, educate, and celebrate recovery. Leading us on this journey are the hosts of the Mind Vine podcast, Darryl Mathers and Chris Bovey.
Well, welcome to the Mind Vine podcast. My name is Darryl Mathers, and I'm solo today. I usually have a co-host, Chris Bovey, but it's just me and my esteemed guest. And I have with me Allison Hector-Alexander. I'm going to read your title because it's long.
A long one.
The Director of the Office of Student Diversity, Inclusions, and Transitions at Durham College. And you've done a host of other work, in women's shelters and different marginalized populations in your career. But you just spoke at Ontario Shores at our Grand Rounds, which you can catch on the Ontario Telemedicine Network as well, about building inclusive spaces. So first of all, welcome.
Thank you.
And tell us a little bit about what you brought to Ontario Shores today.
So thank you for having me and for the invitation. I'm always looking for opportunities to get into the community and have these conversations and look at how we can, create synergies between our institutions. So very happy to be here. And so this morning we talked a little bit about how do we actually build inclusive spaces, but we framed it within, the context of self and in terms of what is our role and our responsibility in trying to create an inclusive space. And when we're talking about inclusion, we're also talking about what is a safe space for us, in that when you walk into a space, how do you feel? Do you feel welcome? Do you feel that you belong? And also recognizing that as service providers or as people in roles of helping or supporting, how do we actually recognize any biases that we have or any privilege that we enjoy, and how does that impact how we support? So in a nutshell, it is, a self, what do we say, how powerful is language, and how does that connect us with the people that we're supporting?
One of your slides was titled "Social Location." You talked a little bit about that, and my interpretation of a social location is all the elements that make us, the unique beings that we are.
Yes.
And being able to be all those different pieces in the workplace or in the community, feeling safe enough, I guess, to do that.
Yes.
And I mean, as somebody who's been in the workplace for a number of years, that's a big shift because we have our personal and private lives. A lot of people work hard to kind of keep those two separate, and that's maybe not that's the way that environment was or is. So how do we kind of navigate that, all those different pieces of our lives?
Absolutely. And historically, as you said, it was, and you are the employee. And so the role that you assume when you walk in through the doors is that of an employee. And this is what we do. You know what your duties are, and you come and you do it, and you separate it. But I think navigating it is recognizing that we are complex, we're layered. And so when we identify our social location, we're looking at the multiple identities that we assume. And when I say identities, it could be, your race or your gender expression, sexual orientation, your family status. It could just be a lived experience. But in being able to separate that is a very tricky and difficult and challenging thing in the workplace, because it's difficult to say, well, bring the employee out today and not bring out, you being a mom or a dad or somebody who's going through a transition, who identifies as a trans person. And so how do you make that separation? And how do now institutions create a space that somebody feels that, okay, you know what, the intersectionalities and the complexities that I have, I'm okay and feel comfortable and safe to be who I am at work. And so I think there is a responsibility, if we are going to say that we're talking about, inclusion as an institution or human rights or equity or diversity. Diversity is who we are. It is those makeup. It is the identity. So if you're saying that, you recognize and you accept a diverse group of people, it's difficult to separate those areas of diversity. You know what I'm saying? And so if you're saying, hey, we have a diverse population, then you also have to anticipate the needs of that diverse population to be who they are in the space that they're acquiring when they're here.
And it only makes too much sense to think that the more comfortable you are, and the more pieces of your social location you can bring to work, the more productive
Absolutely.
you're going to be
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think, like I remember working in spaces that, people were told, well, don't put up any pictures of your children, or don't do. And then you walk into spaces now and across our campus, and people have, pictures of whether it be their partners or their children or their puppies or their community, what is important to them. And they're happy because then you're building these relationships with your colleague. You're building these like really great partnerships because you might have something in common, or you're sharing about your puppy, and people feel like, oh, I feel safe, I can tell you about me, and there may be some synergies there that can happen for us to have partnerships. So as you said, definitely more productivity when people feel that they belong, right? If I walk in and I'm like, well, I can kind of talk about the work that I do, but I shouldn't say that I have two precious little ones at home. Like, so for me not to feel comfortable having that conversation, it's like, oh, so I guess it's not, it doesn't make you whole.
Yeah, you're not
right?
going to get that best
You're not
of that
whole.
person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We all, in the media or in society, the term white privilege, very frequent, very common.
Yes.
But you use the term power and privilege. You gave a couple examples of how we have power and privilege and may not even realize it, regardless of what maybe population we represent.
Yes. And so, yes, we hear white privilege. We hear that, unpacking the privilege, knapsack. But there are other areas. And so if we connect it back to our social location and we connect it back to those identities that we have, we do enjoy privilege and power. So it's interesting because when I do say to students, you have power, and to me, I'm a struggling student, I don't have any power. It's like, yes, there is power that you enjoy because of your identity, because of your social location. So it's not, power only connected to race. There is power and privilege that is connected to, to gender or to, family status, because how we sometimes see our sole support parents, usually women who are single moms, how they may be treated if they come on the bus with a stroller, as opposed to, a family where you have the traditional, mom and dad and little one, versus a same-sex family with children. And so there's different privilege that we enjoy by the mere fact that we occupy different identities, right? Someone who doesn't, who has a religious, not necessarily religious background, but who practices religion, but might not necessarily not wear the hijab, or who doesn't identify as Muslim, given everything that is going on in the world right now, there's privilege that I enjoy as opposed to a female student who wears the hijab and is ridiculed on the bus, or is ridiculed, on the street because is pretty much referred to as a terrorist because they wear the hijab, right? And so it is those areas that we don't usually talk about, and there's a lot of focus on white privilege, but there are other areas that we enjoy privilege. Ability, right? For someone, again, as I mentioned in my, as an example, as an able-bodied person, presently, I pick up and I, say, okay, I'm going to go do this. For someone who's using a mobility device, if the snow isn't shoveled, on the curb, then they cannot get here or get to class. But I grab my bag and I jump in my car and I go. Right, and so we don't always pay attention to this and how that actually impacts how we support or how we interact with each other. Right, for someone who's employed, we enjoy privilege as opposed to someone who's unemployed or in receipt of, income security supports. Right, and so we don't always talk about it, but these are things I think that it is really important that we have an awareness of those things, because then it dictates how we respond. Right, because we respond from our own personal perspective and own personal experience. So when we don't check that, then we know that there will be gaps in how we're supporting.
There was several things that you said today that really stuck with me. But at the beginning, when you kind of introduced power and privilege, you said that this is by no means intended to make anybody feel guilty. And I think inherently we do feel guilty, because we kind of fall into, whether we like it or not, I think we kind of fall into those mechanics of oppression that you kind of laid out in the slide, that we're kind of the products of the information that we were given, and sometimes the information that we were given was the best information they had at the time.
That's what they knew, right? That's
Yeah.
what they knew, and they taught us what they knew. And as I said, well, that's what they were taught, and before them, that was, their parents knew, right? And so really, they do their best in what they think that we need to know in terms of maybe trying to protect us. But that is why, as we mature and we get older, or we start to critically look at the world, we have a responsibility to unlearn. Right, like, okay, where did that come from? Where did I hear that about this group of people? And then here I am sitting with, somebody that I thought that, oh, no, all of these people were this. That person's not like that. So that quickly debunks, right, some of those stereotypes. And so it is, I keep saying to people, there's that responsibility to think of, why do I know this? And where did this come from? And I need this needs to get out of my, right? And how that unlearning happens is important.
When even the admitting that we don't know.
Yes.
And seeking out expert matters or subject matter experts, right? So we would do that in science. We would do that in a host of other areas of our lives. We would look, we go to a mechanic to bring our car. We have somebody who represents maybe a different population, and we don't necessarily go up to them and say, "Tell me more about what it's like to be a Muslim man or a Muslim woman, or a black woman, whatever you may be." We do the opposite.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that's changing, but kind of need to take like an approach like we're gonna go after this. We're gonna be aggressive, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, and have and sometimes the conversation starting it can be a little uncomfortable. And as I mentioned, uncomfortable is not a bad thing, but it is. The majority of people that you would approach and ask about their lived experiences are happy to sit and have a conversation and share that with you. They're not, if it is done in a respectful way, in that I'm coming from a place that I don't know, and I would love to learn about, what are you eating today? Why are you dressed this way? What are you celebrating today? Oh, like it's such a learning, because then you're getting authentic learning from someone who's actually living right that experience. And so why not ask, why not, and that place where I think we've been somewhat set up within our systems to know everything, right? To know, you need to know this, and it's like, if I don't know, it's okay. Now that I know that I don't know this, then I can go and do the research, and I can have the conversation so that I can learn. You know what I mean? But I think it's almost where it's sort of been like, you should not know. You need to know, kind of thing. And there's the pressure, like, that now we know. And then in trying to feel that we know, we make assumptions.
Yep.
Right. And so it is, having those conversations. And so that just going back to the when you mentioned the guilt piece, it is really important that people recognize that when we're having these conversations, it's not about guilt. It's not. And I know it's easier said than done. But really, if you look at it, the student who comes to me and says, I haven't had a meal, I will feel, because I think, oh my God, I just had this massive lunch. Like I'm very full right now. And what can I do to help you? And I might be able to do, to help them in the immediate and put some things in place. But I will still feel that. But recognizing that it wasn't really in my power, because if I didn't know, if there aren't, the extensive support that I can connect them with it. But that doesn't mean that I can maybe make their MoneyGram order come on time, or these other pieces, or, being an able-bodied person, I cannot take some of that ability and give it, but I can recognize it. So, so this is where we sort of have to almost like, separate it and unpack, where that guilt is coming from, right? Because I cannot say, okay, well, I'm going to give you some of my, mobility so that you don't need to be, in a device, but we cannot do that. But I can recognize that if I have something and we're on the second floor, I can make sure that all the elevators are working. I can make sure, like our accessible doors are all working, so that this person comes through with respect, so that there's no, opportunity where they feel, dignity taken away from them because they can't get up the hill because of the snow and all the other pieces. So it is where, check that guilt, because it's not something we can take and share, right? But it's something that we can acknowledge that we have. And
it's not necessarily knowing or not knowing, it's reacting. Right, it's your example of the somebody not being able to get to work because of the snow. It'd be great to have foresight in that, but sometimes we don't learn unless we're in that position.
Exactly.
So it's not so much knowing that, it's how you react.
And how you react. And so here I am, irritated. Why didn't that person come? Like, we needed to get this thing done, and they're not here. And I go back and I get the message, and I'm thinking, oh my God, right? I didn't even think that maybe we should move it to our main building where it was, way more accessible earlier in the morning than in another building. And so for me, I take that as my learning, right? This is my learning. Okay, next time I do better. I know better now. I do better.
One of the things you touched on too is language, and how even in today's kind of even politically correct language can be a barrier. And I think about in my personal experience and growing up in a non-diverse community, and just some of the offensive slurs that were used in common language, and it's changed. So much so when you hear some of these terms now, you're like, whoa, people still say that, but there is still a barrier that's being created by the language we choose to use.
Yes, absolutely. And it is, some of the language is not even so much what we were exposed to necessarily, growing up. Some of the language is new language now that is part of, music culture, part of it just, the language that's being used, say, maybe online, in online communities, that sort of thing. And so it is, again, helping people recognize that power of language. And again, my reference, I go back to students where I say, why is it okay for you to be referred to as this? Are you okay with that? Well, the person is my friend, and they're not coming from a bad place. And I said, yes, but it's the term. I said, so now when this person refers to you, is it okay now that somebody else, no, well, that person cannot refer to me because they're not my friend? And I said, okay, so let's put it into context and have more of a conversation about that. And again, just sort of getting them to start to move beyond the actual use of the words, but also the impact that it can have on them, but for somebody else as well, right? And so it's looking at that power of language, because in as much as, we try to keep up in terms of what is politically correct, many times it's not even just about being politically correct. It is about being inclusive. Right, and so if I'm saying to someone, okay, so if you're referring to me, as a black woman, I would prefer a capital B because it represents a people and how they identify, and you insist on using, small b, there's some conversation we need to have around the education piece of it.
And when you said that example in the presentation, you talked about how, it's not grammatically correct, but the language has been changing since, it's been evolving every year since
it is.
Since the beginning of time. And sometimes we use some of these these models have been in place for years as a crutch for our language or our behavior. That's just the way it's always been. But that can't, in today's world, that can't be. That attitude is not going to get you very far.
Well, that's the thing. That's like saying that it is what it is, and when someone tells me, well, it is what it is, that's how it is, and so that's where I'm like, okay, but how do we have a responsibility here to maybe effect some systemic change? Like how? Well, I don't have any power. Okay, well, do you have allies? Maybe do you have partners or colleagues who would support you to say, okay, we need to change this, or maybe this requires some looking into, or some having some conversation about, sort of looking at those pieces and sort of thinking, okay, what works here, and does this work for everybody, right? And not necessarily if it works for me, yes, but does it work for everybody in terms of how they feel, right, when they're here? So that is really important to look at when we're having those conversations, because it isn't always it is what it is, right? Because then we stop and we give up and we don't effect any change, and we don't, when someone says, this is the pronoun that I refer to myself, or this is my lived experience, it might not come naturally to me because it's not grammatically correct, but I will make the effort. So I had a student, and one of my first experiences with, pronouns was that they said, this is, and I thought, oh, that's going to be a little bit, and I recognized with them that this, I will mess up sometimes, recognize that, but it's not going to come from a bad place, and I'm going to make the effort. Right, so it didn't automatically come to me to say they and their and them, but I tried and I put the effort in. And so there were a couple of times where I'm like, I'm sorry, because the presented, maybe one day presented maybe more female, and then the next day maybe presented more male. And so for me, my mind almost had to, catch up. But I know it was important for them because that was their lived reality. And so I had to make the effort.
And your own personal growth, right? Because
absolutely.
We are gonna stumble, and it's like anything. It's like when you're going to school and you're learning a new subject. You're not an expert. You're not,
and that is a self-awareness piece, right? Because the self-awareness piece doesn't say that we're gonna get it on the first go. We're not getting it on the first go or the second go. Maybe, we're going to mess up sometimes. But if we have the awareness that this is how I feel about something, as I said, there are biases and we all have these biases. But if we recognize we have them and we know how they influence how we react or how we communicate or how we, support, our clients and our customers, then we're already aware that they might have a role to play or be an influence. So how? Right? How do we check that? So this isn't to say that, oh my God, like you're good and you don't have these biases. No, we all have it. But it is the awareness piece of checking it, right? Because we probably wouldn't get it right the first time or the second time, but we can work towards it, right? It's the effort.
And I think Ontario Shores is one of many organizations. We're on a human rights journey, and that's part of the reason we had you here today is to kind of have conversations about the themes that relate to human rights. And as we've gone through this, the one thing that's kind of been clear to me is this is not about Ontario Shores as an organization or any organization trying to make change or be a human rights friendly organization. It's really about individuals.
Yes.
They're the ones that are going to make the change.
Absolutely. And again, as you said, when you are looking at change or you're looking at any shifts that happen, whether in service provision or how we interact with each other, how we sort of recognize each other, it comes from the people. It comes from the people who are looking for that inclusion to happen, who are looking at, I wish, they would celebrate this, who are looking for, you know what I mean? Because, people want to bring what they live, with them to work and be recognized and have those celebrations. And one of the things that I've learned from our students is that celebration is really important. I have seen our international students go from, just being being in groups with each other and so on. And when it comes to celebrating, Holi or something else, they come out of their shells, they're celebrating and they celebrate, right? You know what I mean? So these things are important. So it comes from the people, where, it's like having these conversations so that you can kind of take it back around. So what does that inclusion piece mean to you? What does that look like in your space, in your little office group, in your, bigger program areas or anything like that? What does that inclusion look like specific to your area?
Well, you've given us lots to think about. I think, like I said earlier, I think it's a perfect fit for what we're going through as an organization, and what I'm sure organizations all over the place are going through is in tackling human rights. It's not a buzzword. Yeah. It's about how we treat each other and that kind of curious respect that we have every day. So thank you very much for helping further the conversation and for joining us on the podcast.
My pleasure. And just remembering too that it is a process, right? We don't kind of get it right on that first try. It is let's see what works and let's go back to your drawing board and okay, this works. Okay, this is good. And how do we apply it, sort of thing. But it was my absolute pleasure being here with you. And thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for the advice. Have a great day.
Good stuff.
Begins and ends with begins and ends.